Good afternoon, everyone. We are moving away from Joshua as we have completed the book, and we now enter into the continuation, which is in the book of Judges. The book of Judges is somewhat different in its context because it is at a time that is after Moses and Joshua. uh, let's do a little bit of an introduction and then we'll get into chapter 1. We need to be aware that Moses was the major personality, a major person at the time of the Exodus, right? As well as the time of the wanderings in the wilderness. But there was also a period where Moses actually conquered the eastern side of the Jordan, and Moses died. And thereby, Joshua continued the conquests. And this would be Joshua. And Joshua died. So we are now concerned with this period of time in the book of Judges. Now, the conquest had something very major that happened. At the end of the conquest, the land was apportioned. And by the Urim and Thummim, the rocks that were under the breastplate of the high priest, God had instructed them who gets what land. And so the land was given out to the 12 tribes. And then for a period of time, Joshua grew old and he died. And now we begin the book of Judges at this continuation. When we enter into the book of Judges, you would find that there are no leaders quite like Moses and Joshua, because these two were the kind of prophets in the sense that God spoke directly to them and dealt directly with Moses and Joshua and led the children of Israel through all the events. Now, after Joshua, we do not have a replacement, and this is a very critical period of time that the Canaanites who were still in the land, and there were many, and that would be the responsibility of each of the tribes to eradicate all of these Canaanites. Otherwise, they would be faced with future challenges. Now that Joshua had died, the wars would be important because the Canaanites would think that since the Israelites do not have any more leaders, then perhaps they would be in a bit of a quandary. They wouldn't be united. They won't know what to do. And so those wars at the initial stages would be critical. Whether the Canaanites would be winning and be more bold to attack Israel, or would they go and be subservient to the Israelites? Now, what we have on the screen would be the era of the judges. We can see that this is actually a table I've taken from Gaon of Vilna. This would be a Jewish commentator of the past. And the dates here given would be the Jewish dates, which I would prefer because it maps according to their own timeline. It would be very difficult for us to map to our modern day timeline. Now, all of these are called judges, and by way of introduction, they are not judges in the legal sense. It means that they are not the ones that would sit in the court of law but they will actually make decisions on cases. But the reason why they are called judges is because they're not kings, they're not leaders of the royalty sort. These judges, as we make known on the chart, is that they are the ones that is more renowned. They are more known. They have arisen to invoke the Torah of God on the people so that they too become keepers of the Torah, and so that peace and harmony may continue in the land. Then these judges will be the ones that will put them all in place until we came to the last one, that would be Samuel. And we have seen that in First Samuel. The people then eventually demanded a king, and King Saul became the king. But we are now at the period of time between Joshua and Saul. And Saul would be right after Samuel, because Saul is king of Israel. Before that, when we are talking about the judges, the king would be God. But they had a problem having God as king because they don't know how to relate to God in that sense. The nations around them all have kings, but they seem to be governed each in their own territory by the Torah, and there will be elders and there will be judges in place. And so we will be talking about these judges at the time in between Joshua and Saul. And then we will see how they would engage. And it's quite interesting because we have a few times where they say that in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was proper in his own eyes. They thought to do what they wished. And so oftentimes they fell out of favor with God, and God withdrew his protection upon the nation. And then the Canaanites eventually got the better of them every now and then. But we must bear in mind the days where the Israelites were faithful to God was far more than the days they were not faithful to God. We begin Judges chapter 1, and we will look at chapters 1 and 2 in a quicker approach because it provides us a landscape that was referring back to the book of Joshua as well. Now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked God, saying, "Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" Now, this idea here is that there were a lot of land that was still occupied by the Canaanites. If we have gone through the book of Joshua, it would have ended that they grew weary of fighting and they went to establish their own towns, their own locations, and they didn't quite bother with those nations, which are the Canaanites, that were staying on the coastal area from Gaza all the way up. The Israelites tended to live inland in the low valleys and in the high ground, but not at the sea. And so they weren't seafaring people. And we now are talking about the Canaanites who are still there. Now, the Lord said, now this would be interesting because there is no more Joshua, and Joshua isn't speaking to them, and God wasn't speaking to them directly as well. So it has been said that this would have been the Urim and Tumim, some very simple instructions. Who is going? And Judah's name was picked, and they would understand this as God saying, Judah will go first. I have delivered the land into his hand. And this would be the Canaanite occupancy in the area of Judah. And Judah said to Simeon, his brother, "Come up with me to my allotted territory that we might fight against the Canaanites and I will go likewise with you to your allotted territory. Now, understand this. The territory of Simeon is actually in the territory of Judah. So Simeon, but for all intents and purposes, didn't have their own piece of land, but they actually have it within the control of Judah. And so both brothers would be tantamount to go and clear the area. And so Simeon went with him. Now, this is important. And so verse 4 says, Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites, the Perizzites, into their hand, as God has promised. They killed 10,000 men at Bezek. And they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek. So Adoni-Bezek is one of the most important leader in this area, but we find that his name wasn't even recorded in the conquest in the book of Joshua. But yet it is recorded here because they fought. They were the last ones who fought against Judah. And Judah defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And then Adoni-Bezek fled. And they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Now understand this. This is not a standard way for the Israelites to harass and torture their opponents. This is perhaps, as we can see from the history of the book of Judges, this is a one-off. Why? And so we read from verse 7, and this is Adoni-Bezek's own claim. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. It means that Adoni-Bezek was the one who practiced cutting off thumbs and toes and humiliating 70 kings. And they said they were gathering scraps under my table. They were humiliated before him. As I have done, so God has repaid me. If you look at verse 7, it says the word repaid is shalem. This is an interesting expression, shalem. Shalem is about completing a compensation, right? A compensation, and it is completed. And so what he means by using this word is that he has done all these things and God has done it back to him, and the compensation has been completed. That God has punished him by cutting off his thumbs and big toes, which he practiced on others. That is his expression, right? And by saying that, this would be a confession and a surrender to God. And by doing this, they didn't kill him. They brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died naturally. And so we need to understand that the way that the Israelites fight is not brutal. The way the Canaanites fight is brutal. And so this is to remind us that this is a one-off, because of what Adoni-Bezek had done to 70 other kings. God used this as an instruction to teach him a lesson. And that's why he said, God has compensated. He has rewarded me for all the brutality I've done. And this is complete. I've lost my toes and thumbs. Now, in verse 8 onwards, you find that this is first a recollection of Joshua 15. Joshua 15 is about Judah in the conquest. So the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem and they took it. Now understand, Jerusalem at this time did not belong to Judah. They took it, they set the city on fire, and they left. They went down to fight the Canaanites who dwelt in the mountains in the south and in the lowland and in Hebron, and they killed Sheshai, Achiman, and Talmai. Now, what does that mean is this: Jerusalem belongs to Benjamin. They are part of the Jebusite territory, and Benjamin did not get rid of the Jebusites. And in this case, Judah went to fight against, and they could have conquered, but they didn't. They did not occupy Jerusalem until Second Samuel chapter 15. This is a continuation of Joshua 15 about Caleb. He says, whoever attacks Kiryat Sefer takes him, I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother or stepbrother, took it. And so Caleb gave his daughter Achsah as wife. And so all these were recorded in Joshua chapter 15. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and lower springs because the land that she had didn't have much water. Now it comes to a very strange passage concerning the children of the Canaanite. Now, children of Canaanite is Cani. They are the descendants of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. Now, understand this, that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, and his descendants were friends of Israel. For whatever Jethro has done, Israelites always remembered Moses' father-in-law's descendants. They came and went up from the city of palms. Now, the city of palms is a bit questionable as to what constitutes that. And many think that the city of palms, it could be near Hebron, right? Near Hebron. They always stayed with the children of Judah and gave them refuge. And then they went into the wilderness, which lies in the south near Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people there. And so Judah went with his brother Simeon and attacked the Canaanites. And from here, you need to see verse 17 will be the continuation of verse 2. Judah and Simeon went to fight. They went to fight those who inhabited in Zephath, in Hormah, in Gaza, in Ashkelon, in Ekron. All these are the Philistine territory. And so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. Now, this is very strange indeed. It's like God was with Judah and they could fight the high ground people, which was the hardest, but somehow in the lowland, which is the easier to defeat, they could not. And the excuse was they had chariots of iron. How was that possible? Why was it difficult to attack the iron chariots? Now, it appears that the iron chariots is something which the Israelites didn't have. Whereas in the mountains, they had none because the chariots worked in the lowland. So as we go on in the book of Judges, we see all the time the chariots of iron gave the Israelites a lot of trouble. Verse 20, they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses said, and then expelled there the three sons of Anak. But Benjamin, the children of Benjamin, did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So you can see Benjamin has control of Jerusalem. They did not chase out the Jebusites, so the Jebusites dwelled with the children of Benjamin until this day. Until when? Until 2 Samuel chapter 5. Now the house of Joseph went up against Bethel. Now understand, the house of Joseph is made up of two parts. The house of Joseph has Ephraim and Manasseh. They went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. Every time you read the Lord was with them, then they will be victorious. The house of Joseph sent men to spy out Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. When the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, "Please show us the entrance of the city. We will show you mercy." Meaning, after the man showed them the entrance to the city, this man was not struck down by the sword. And they struck the city with the edge of the sword. Now, they could mean the entire house of Joseph, or they could mean those who were watching the city. And they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz. So there is a second town by the name of Luz, which is its name until this day. As you recall in the book of Joshua, the first tribe that was given their land was actually Judah, and then came Ephraim and Manasseh. So Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, Ta'anak and its villages, the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, the inhabitants of Ephraim, its villages, inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. For the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. They weren't about to leave. And so Manasseh could not chase them out, and so had to leave them there. And so it came to pass, when Israel was strong, they put the Canaanites under tribute. What does that mean? Now, under tribute means they had to pay what we call a tribute. Pay tribute, which is money. It's like a tax collected from the Canaanites so that they can stay there, because the Manasseh descendants did not completely drive them out. They had to leave them there. Verse 29, first Manasseh, then Ephraim. They did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them, nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. The Canaanites dwelt among them. They were put under tribute. So all of them were, because now the Israelites were powerful, but they could not drive them out. So they said, okay, fine. If you stay here, you must give me money every year. Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, which is towards the north. It would be north of Haifa today, nor the inhabitants of Sidon or Achlav, Achziv, Helva, and Afik or Rehov. And so the Asherites, the descendants of Asher, dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. We come to verse 33, and so we go through one by one of the tribes. They did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, nor the inhabitants of Beth Anat, and so they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anat was put under tribute to them, so they had to pay. Very similar to the time when the Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar, came and put the kings of Judah under tribute. And so the Judah kings had to give money to Nebuchadnezzar. So this is that kind of a concept in the ancient times. And the Amorites, on the other hand, forced the children of Dan into the mountains. Meaning what? If you see this, you have the mountains. The Amorites chase Dan up the mountain. That is what it means. For they would not allow them to come to the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, in Ayalon, in Shaalbim. And when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. And the boundary of the Amorites were from the ascent of Akravim, from Selah and upward. So what that means is eventually you find that Dan would move to the north as well. So Dan was just in the area of Ephraim, but they didn't have enough space. So in the book of Joshua, we were told eventually Dan went up north above all the tribes and occupied a land, and then known as the northernmost part of the land of Israel. So in chapter 1, we are just told of how each of them went to fight, but they couldn't beat the Canaanites to drive them out. That was the important element. If they don't drive the Canaanites out, they did the next best thing and put them under tribute. But the fear was that the Israelites will not be strong forever. And then the Canaanites became strong and didn't give tribute, and then came to disturb the Israelites and perhaps intermarry with them. And that was the dire fear that Jehovah was warning the Israelites: do not intermarry them, do not serve their gods. When you see their altars, you must break them all. But they were not able to do that by themselves, and they didn't finish the job. With this, we come to the end of chapter 1, and this will paint the background for us, because they are now in a tribal mode, that each tribe took care of their own business, and there was no overarching leader like Moses and Joshua to lead them. And so they had to continue to keep the Torah. And so since they cannot drive out the Canaanites, they had to live with them. And so the story that is recorded in the book of Judges tells us the ongoing narrative of what happened when the 12 tribes had the Canaanites under their noses, living amongst them. Now, one of the things that were not discussed in this chapter as a background, which we must know, is that the eastern shore of the Jordan, where we have half tribe Manasseh, we have Gad and Reuben, and those were the parcels of land that was taken by Moses when he was around, and they had completely drove out the original inhabitants. And so the Canaanites were on the western shore of the Jordan, and the eastern shore is clear of all enemies. But the western shore had enemies living amongst them. So the idea that we will be having from chapter 2 onwards would be this backdrop, that the tribes had tried, but they failed, yet they were still strong. And so they put the Canaanites under tribute. They were still living amongst them in some parcels of land, but they were controlled by the Israelites. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 1.